So for study guide 62, we're going to be focusing on Italian innovation and experimentation in painting. We will also see some architecture and sculptural objects as well. So we're going to be looking at the Trecento, or the late Gothic Proto-Renaissance period in Italy. This is a time that is normally thought about being the things that lead to the Renaissance. Hence the reason they often call it the Proto-Renaissance. Trecento means 300, so this is the 1300s or the 14th century. So in our textbook, it really talks about 4 or 5 different locations during this time period, but we'll mostly focus our attention in Germanic regions as well as Italy. So common subject matter. In the 1300s, this is the time of the bubonic plague. And so many artworks was focused on either the triumph of death, so how death kind of hits all elements of society, or objects and imagery that was, emphasizing the glories of God and the forgiveness of sins. And so there's a lot of dark imagery that comes from this time period. So this is very stereotypical of these triumph of death scenes. This is at the Camposanto in Pisa. The Camposanto is part of that Romanesque complex. And so we have the Cathedral of Pisa, we have the Campanile or bell tower, we have the baptistry. So this is where the baptism takes place. But the Camposanto is this above ground cemetery. And so this is what the interior looked like. This would have been painted on one of these masonry walls. So in this imagery, it's in your textbook as well. There's basically a series of scenes based on the triumphs of death. So there is a pile of dead bodies where angels are lifting their souls up into the heavens. There's a hermit monk living off by himself so that he will be untouched by the plague. There's a series of maidens in a garden, seemingly unaware about all this death that's taking place right on the left of them. There's a series of writers of high elite status who are happening upon some coffins on the roadside. And so they're like shielding themselves from the smell of the death and the decay. So this is pretty stereotypical. So here's a close-up of that group of people, right? So here is another image that comes from this era, and this is called the Rottgen Pieta. So we want to think about who is depicted and what is a Pieta, right? So this is an image of Mary with the dead Christ sitting at her lap. Okay, and so Pieta always has Mary and Christ seated together on a throne. And so when we look at this, we can see how a Pieta relates to the first hours of Jesus's life as well as his last, right? So you would not normally see a grown man sitting on the lap of his mother. So that alludes to her holding him like a baby. And then of course you see his dead body across her lap with his head almost seems like it's broken and his emaciated body, right? So thinking about the function of this, how are you supposed to relate to this image, right? This is all about sympathy and empathy, right? Sympathy is that we see the hardships, we see the brokenness of his body, we see the tortured expression of her face. But then thinking about how she relates to us going to look at this, we see that she would understand. It works very much like an icon painting in that when we look at her, she would empathize with our hardships. She feels our pain. She feels our anguish. And so she is there to listen to us, right? So thinking about how you should interact with her, right? So looking at the style of it, you want to think about the style and how it is late Gothic. It's not completely proportional. It has a rather large head, right? But it does have a lot of intricate detail to it. You can see the emaciated body, you can see the blood running down his arm, you see the wounds gushing blood, you see his broken body where it looks like his neck is broken back, you see the anguish of his face, you see him succumbing to death, right? This is not the only kind of Pietà that was made during this time period. Some of them were not as gruesome as this Rottgen Pieta that we have here. So this is German, made out of wood. It's painted wood. This one is also polychrome, so it is gilded wood, right? But some of these are much more joyous. Some of these scenes coming out of Paris in France or in Hungary show beautiful Mary. So these are kind of those two depictions of Mary that are typical, either the beautiful Mary or the anguished Mary who can sympathize with us. So these are like the glories of heaven and, you know, his power to overcome. And then scenes like this are supposed to sympathize with us, to feel the cause of sin, to understand that he is broken because of the sins of man. Here's some examples of some of the altarpieces from this time period as well. They typically were made out of wood and have Byzantine sort of characteristics where they tend to be very flat and lack depth, no visual background, use of gold, jewel tones. So as we can see us moving away from the medieval into the Renaissance, there was many factors that led to this. Obviously, we have our Black Plague, or those dark ages that were caused by the bubonic plague, where 30 to 40% of the European population was destroyed. We have a great schism in the church. We have the rise of art and literature. We have the rise of humanism, especially in the city of Florence in Italy. And we have the rise of the artists and artisans in this region as well. So we start to learn the names of some of these people, right? So I'm going to zip through some of this architecture. This is Ponte Vecchio in Florence. This is the city hall. And you can see how some of the architecture still looks very medieval with the castle wall lines, the emphasis on the vertical. The only reason to point this out to you is this is a loggia. So when you go to Florence, there's many examples of Renaissance and Baroque sculpture kept in a loggia. Loggias are like outdoor art galleries, so you can go see there. But there's also a bunch of recreations of famous pieces like the David by Michelangelo in the public square, the piazza. We have the cathedral or the Duomo of Florence as well. And this is an example of Italian Gothic. Still has an emphasis on light and bright, but Italian Gothic typically uses a lot of the marble that is typical of this region. So this is in Tuscany and Florence. So we have the light pinks and the deep greens and the white on the exterior, very similar to like the Pisa Cathedral that we just saw, right? And so the dome was not built during this era, but everything else was constructed and designed during the Gothic period. So even though it's not French Gothic, it is definitely a good example of Italian Gothic. So you can see Italian characteristics, Roman characteristic, with a new emphasis on verticality. So this time period is often, the Trecento is considered its own sort of art period, and the theme for it is called Observe the Bean Sprout. So artists like Giotto start to show an interest in the natural world, meaning that they observe the natural world and they draw and paint from it to create a sense of realism. So like a sprout, though small and young, seem determined to break through the crusty soil and reach the sun. So that is symbolic of this idea of these artists and artworks are virtually unknown at first, and then they start to kind of break through and gain a sense of fame. So the nurturing roots of this 14th century Italian art is a new economic strength, the philosophy of humanism, and a new emphasis on personal experience. We even saw this in the Rottgen Pieta, this idea that we should be able to commiserate with Mary, right? This idea that she feels our emotion and we can feel hers. So this idea of empathy and sympathy, right? So this period is marked by many great altar pieces. So people like Cimabue, Giotto, and so on. And this is called Greco-Manneria, or the manner of the Greeks. So here they're emulating Byzantine painting. And so we have the use of gold, very formal organizations, the jewel-like tones that are very characteristic. Oh, there you go. So here's the characteristics of that. We don't have any of these images in our image set, but this is pretty stereotypical of what you would learn in a typical art history class. So I want to make sure that we get that. Right? And so you can see some of the differences between something that is Byzantine, so from the East, and then something that is like faux Byzantine, Greek Manneria of Italy. Okay, these were typically done in tempera, and tempera is an egg-based paint where they use the white of the egg as a binder. So the binder is the thing that holds the pigment together onto the surface, and they use thin layers of thin layers of paint to create the detail. So there's a sense of modeling. You can see the difference in light and dark, especially on the fabric. So Italian early proto-Renaissance artwork obviously has a classical tilt to it. So this is the artist Giotto, who we have in our 250. And so you can see how massive Mary is here, how three-dimensional she looks, how Greek she looks in a way. Notice how her knees kind of press through the fabric. So all of these, I should go back, all of these would be inserted into an altarpiece, and often the altarpiece looks like a miniature sort of Gothic cathedral. This one is in Orsan Misceli, which is a civic building inside the city of Florence. So there's a chapel inside the civic building. Okay, so that leads us to the last piece that we have for today from the for the 250, and that's going to be the Scrovegni or Arena Chapel. And so we're going to watch a video focusing on the function of the chapel and how it's visually organized.
In the Arena Chapel, a small private chapel that was connected to a palace that was owned by the Scrovegni family.
And it was the Scrovegni family who commissioned Giotto to decorate this chapel with frescoes.
It's called the Arena Chapel because it's next to an ancient Roman arena.
When you're inside it as we are now, I have to say that it's taller than I expected, and that feeling of being enclosed by images that happens when you're in a space entirely covered with fresco.
There are lots of narrative scenes, but even in between those scenes are tromoloi faux marble panels, and we get the sense that there is inlaid stone, but in fact, this is all painting.
And that extends even onto the ceiling, where we have a star-studded blue sky with images of Christ and Mary and other saints and figures.
The Arena Chapel is organized in a very strict way. 3 registers begin at the top and move downward. I think of it as a spiral, that is, it tells a continuous story. It begins with Christ's grandparents. It goes into the birth of Mary, her marriage, and then when we get down to the second register, we get to Christ's life or ministry. And then the bottom register is the Passion. These are the events at the end of Christ's life and immediately after his death.
Now, all of this is thanks to, strangely, it might seem to us today, a sin, the sin of usury that weighed heavily on the conscience of Enrico Scrovegni, whose palace was next door and who owned this land and built this chapel and hired Giotto. His father was a usurer. Enrico himself was a usurer.
So what this means is he charged interest. Just like when you borrow money from a bank, you're charged interest. When you put money on a credit card, you're charged interest. And so in a very Catholic environment, being a banker made you a lot of money, but it also, in your belief system, would send you to hell. And Dante, the great late medieval poet, in his most famous poem, The Divine Comedy, singles out Scrovegni's father for one of the more treacherous parts of hell.
So Enrico was really worried, and for this reason, he did, in Catholic belief system, a good work. He built this chapel. This was his way of atoning for the sin of usury, hoping that this would help his soul to go to heaven. And we see Enrico himself here in this chapel on the wall over the entrance where Giotto painted the Last Judgment. We see Enrico kneeling, handing the chapel over
to the three Marys, the Virgin Mary in the middle.
Notice where Enrico has put himself. He's on the side of the blessed. In the Last Judgment, we see Christ at the very top, and the damned are on Christ's left, and the blessed are on Christ's right, and that's where we find Enrico.
And the impetus for the entire cycle can be seen at the apex of the triumphal arch on the opposite wall, with God, who calls Gabriel to his side, telling him to go to the Virgin Mary and announce to her that she will bear humanity's Savior, that she will bear Christ.
Interestingly, when Giotto painted God, he inserted a panel painting, so that is not fresco. It's interesting that he chose to paint it in a style that was more conservative, less earthly than the style that we see in the frescoes. But just to go back to that wall, we begin to see the illusionism that we see throughout the cycles. If we look to Mary and the angel, Giotto has created an architectural space for each of them. These are not panel paintings with gold backgrounds that suggest a divine space. These are earthly settings for Mary and the angel.
Two scenes below the Annunciation are these wonderful empty architectural spaces, these rooms that have oil lanterns that hang from their ceilings. And there is such a delicate sense of space, of light and shadow. It is this bravura example of naturalism, and it shows Giotto's interest in the world, the present, the physical space that humanity occupies.
So think about who was the patrons of these pieces and how they are similar and how are they different, right? They're both made from wealthy people, right? One of them is used, for teaching religious context. One was solely for saving somebody's soul, right, from hell. And so they are still organizationally arranged into a grid-like pattern. So here is some imagery that we have at the Arena Chapel. So we have the altar end, which is this end here. And so then we also have our back wall, thinking about the function of this. So here on the back wall, as you leave, you're going to be reminded of heaven and hell. So on a Romanesque church, you would have that in the portal when you enter the church. Here we have it on the exit wall as a reminder as you leave that you have a choice. You have a choice to do good and go to heaven, right? Or you have the choice to do evil and then eventually go to hell. The altar area here is all about the glory of Jesus and then, of course, the righteousness of Scrovegni. So we have Enrico Scrovegni, right? This is the son of the banker. And so basically here he had Giotto paint the entire room in dedication to atone for the sin of usury or of lending money with interest. Right? So This is the image that you guys have for the entire arena chapel. So we have the altar end here, and then we have our ceiling. This ceiling is pretty typical. This is actually what the Sistine Chapel ceiling looked like before Michelangelo painted his very famous ceiling. So here we have ultramarine blue, that used from lapis lazuli coming from Afghanistan, a very expensive color, painted like a starry night on the ceiling with little rondelles on that ceiling as well. And then on the wall, we have the different stories. So on the first level here, right, the first level, we have dado, or we have fake marble. So we can see that Roman characteristic here, remembering that this is in Padua, which is in Tuscany. So this is in Italy. And then things are divided with faux marble as well. And so then here we have the scenes of Mary's family, right? Then we have scenes of the ministries of Jesus. And then we have the stories of the Passion at the bottom. So all of these scenes are based on New Testament. There are no Old Testament scenes here at all. And these images typically all relate to one another in how they are told. Besides the faux marble, there's also these grisaille, so these monochromatic images painted that are supposed to look like faux. So like, once again, instead of fake marble, we have fake sculptural elements there as well. So this is out of our textbook and showing how there is, kind of normally a comparison between stories from the ministry of Jesus, like the rising of Lazarus, and then in the Passion, underneath of it, we have the rising of Jesus. So there's a parallel in the imagery here. In the marriage of Cana, we have the miracle over the body, excuse me, the mourners of Jesus mourning his dead body, right? This is done in buon fresco. So buon fresco is where pigment is added to damp plaster. So there's a very elaborate process used in creating a fresco painting. To a wall, they would add two different types of quality of plaster, one rough and then one smooth, and the smooth is at the very top. Then they would draw on it or stamp an image on top of it from what was actually often called a cartoon. And then they would paint on it, and they would have to paint on the plaster just at the right time. So the right time would be when the plaster starts to heat up, and it would allow the pigment to be locked in. The other kind of fresco is called fresco secca, which is dry plaster painting, and that could only be used with certain colors. Often the colors would flake off of it, but sadly the lapis lazuli from the ceiling, or the blue that is often used in the skies of Giotto's paintings, were done in this ultramarine, and so it had to be done with fresco secca. But most of it was painted on wet or damp plaster. Right? So probably the most famous image by Giotto. So Giotto is, during this Trecento, I should say, we started to learn the names of very famous painters. So Cimabue was the teacher of Giotto. We also have Duccio. And so we know of their great works. And probably the greatest work of Giotto is the Lamentation. So it's one of those small little paintings on the walls, right? And so how is it not medieval? What are the things that move this into a new time period or new characteristic, right? There is an emphasis on composition. Up until now, almost all images that we've seen have had center focus, where the most important character is in the center. Now, we do have someone in the center, and he's very animated here, but I would not say this image is about him. Everything compositionally, how it's organized, how people are gesturing, tells us that the most important person is laying right here, right? So the landscape uses directional lines to pull your eye down right to him. All of the bodies are gesturing and facing towards him. This idea of showing the backs of something, we've never seen anything like that before. We haven't seen people's not showing their faces. So they're in front, right? And all the bodies are gesturing. And we have all these different people showing various signs of emotion. We show these men, right, contemplating his death. So they're being very logical and not very emotional about it. But then we see the passion of this man here, where he gestures in anguish. We have women holding their heads. We have crying. We have anguish. And so we see all these different ranges of emotion that we didn't necessarily see in earlier medieval pieces. And you also have a depiction of the natural world. We have a relatively more realistic landscape. We have the tree, we have the hillside, we have more proportion between the landscape and the people in the foreground. We don't necessarily have it as miniature as we saw in the Gothic period. And then lastly, we have a lot of modeling. Modeling is the transition from light and dark that makes things look 3D. And he was able to achieve that with all of that range of value. And he'd have to do that rather quickly. Remember, he's working section by section as he goes. And then the brilliance of color. He used harmonic colors. He would repeat the blues from the sky into the imagery. He repeats the reds, he repeats the gold, he repeats the yellow throughout the composition. And there's a sense of composition and continuity and style throughout the entire chapel. So each of those panels looked like they were made by the same artist, and the scale of the chapel and the scale of the endeavor points us to the greatness of the Renaissance, right? So thinking about how the composition focuses you, remember that everything points you to Jesus's body. Even the angels flailing in the sky are full of anguish, right? And then here's another example of a great master. This is Duccio, contemporary of Giotto. Giotto used a lot of blue, Duccio used a lot of red. His style is a little bit more Byzantine. This is the Maestra, which is a colossal altarpiece that was made. And it had scenes of the life of Jesus on it as well. It's basically broken up, and different panels of it are in different museums. And so you can see the differences in the style, but these would have been contemporaries of each other.